From the Adama journals. We often debate the differences between individual death and mass death. People say there is more sorrow involved in mourning the end of a loved one's life than in mourning the tragic annihilation of hundreds or thousands or millions of victims whose identities are unknown to us. I'm not sure that's true. I have viewed the death in action of a son, and also been forced to consider individual deaths and mass deaths that were all part of the same insidious event in history. It seems to me all the deaths were intricately connected to my sorrow in ways that I could never explain. The tangled, subdued sorrow over the multiple deaths of some mass disaster is, I believe, no less intense, no less meaningful, no less important than the more dramatic outward show of grief for a person who has had the considerable misfortune to die alone. Battlestar Galactica by Glenn A. Larson and Robert Thurston. Chapter 2. As Adama directed the launching of the Galactica's counterattacking forces with growled commands and fierce, violent gestures, his counterpart on the enemy side was in a calm state of meditative relaxation, as he maintained complete surveillance of his meticulously planned battle strategy. He was sitting in the exact center of the Cylon equivalent of a battlestar, a circular vehicle which tapered down almost to a point through several dark and metal-webbed deck levels. Power for the ship emanated upward from the nether point, where highly volatile liquid Tilium was mixed with neutralizing fuels and forced into the generational systems by the action of what appeared to be revolving pinwheels. Humans who had glimpsed the formidable Cylon base ships up close had unanimously described them as spinning tops. The Cylon commander, whose name would translate into Adama's language as Imperious Leader, sat above his officers on a huge pedestal whose sides were marked with hundreds of sharp-edged and barbed points that sent off sporadic threatening gleams in the shifting light of the immense chamber. On his many-eyed, knobby head, whose surface colors were various shades of gray, like shadows without sources, he was now wearing a helmet that was the Cylon version of the massive communications panel aboard the Galactica. All the same informational units that spread across one side of the Galactica's bridge were contained in miniature in the helmet. With it, Imperious Leader could keep track of all phases of the battle simultaneously. At the same time, the helmet was feeding him the necessary abstract information from which he could formulate the proper improvisations on the battle strategy. All of this information was being transmitted to him from a contingent of executive officers who circled the pedestal and dispatched their data in invisible beams upward to the leader's helmet. The Cylon officers were also in helmet contact with each other, so that trifling and unnecessary bits of information could be filtered out before transmission to the leader. If the transmission beams had been visible, the headquarters chamber of Imperious Leader would appear to the casual observer as an impossibly intricate spider's web. In spite of it all, the communication activity, the dimly lit room populated by unmoving figures cemented in sitting and standing positions, suggested a rigid serenity, an alien gentlemen's club with members engaged in apparently harmless contemplations. In his third brain, the one that monitored the functioning of his other two brains, Imperious Leader enjoyed a deep flow of satisfaction. His entire life had been pointed toward this moment, the final and overwhelming defeat of the alien pest that had infected the perfect unity of the universe. He had been born at a time when the war had been going on, in human measurement, for about 700 years. His first brain, replacing the rudimentary one that trained and educated him in his early years, had been awarded him at the proper ceremony marking his passing from childhood to maturity. First brains were the basic guidance system of both the Cylon citizen and warrior. Since the first brain's activities concentrated on perceptions related to information gathering and efficient performance in whatever job had been assigned the individual Cylon at the maturity ceremony, only the simple interpretive powers were implanted in it. In Imperious Leader's case, his childhood achievements, especially the physical ones, had qualified him for the coveted job level of warrior. Even better, he had quickly ascended to fighter pilot status, and won the name that would have been loosely translated into human language as Ace of Aces. As a result of his mastery of warfare techniques, he had been awarded the second brain much earlier than his peers. The second brain gave him the abilities necessary for Cylon officers, particularly the gift of analyzing and interpreting information. When the second brain operated in conjunction with the first brain integrally, as it always did for Imperious Leader, one rose to the level of executive officer. He had become one of the youngest executive officers in the history of his race. He knew now that, if he removed his helmet and let his many eyes survey the officers surrounding the pedestal, he would be besieged by keen memories of himself doing their jobs, interpreting and filtering data for previous Imperious Leaders. When the most recent Imperious Leader had reached the end of his reign, each leader held power for a specific term, about 3/4 of a century in human time. Although the Cylons used no such constricting measurements of linear time, he dictated his selection as successor. Whatever his choice, no grumbling would have been heard from the Cylon executive officers, because there was no aspiration to power. Cylons believed that the decrees of their superiors at any level, or in any position, originated in a master plan known completely only to the Imperious Leader. For them, it was only logical, since Imperious Leaders were the only Cylons with a third brain, and therefore the only Cylons in possession of all information. Even though he displayed his reaction to none of his fellow officers, the present Imperious Leader had been mildly surprised when his predecessor had selected him. The awarding of leadership generally went to one of the officers senior in command experience. He had served long and well, but did not consider himself eligible for the supreme echelon until the next time of selection. However, with the same stoicism with which he would have reconciled himself to death in battle, he accepted the awarding of the third brain. As soon as it had been implanted, he understood why his predecessor, who now communicated with him telepathically, had selected him. Besides being part of that telepathic network connecting the few third brain holders who had not as yet selected their time of death, he now possessed, according to Cylon belief, the capability of limitless wisdom. While the second brain had allowed him a substantial amount of understanding about what happened, why it happened, and how it happened, the third brain allowed him to transcend the tyranny of mere facts, to rise above the limitations of trivial speculation, insight, and idea. With the third brain, he could connect his first brain information and second brain interpretations of the information to a vast accumulation of knowledge going back in time very nearly to the beginning of the Cylon culture. He discovered that not every Cylon could admit the third brain into his body, and, in fact, most of his compatriots would have involuntarily rejected it. For that reason primarily, the selection of successor to Imperious Leader was always carried out with extreme care. Tests at the implanting of the first brain indicated the few Cylons who had third brain potential. Those who qualified were kept under intense scrutiny during the ensuing years. Some were weeded out when certain character instabilities emerged in difficult test situations, while others were merely killed in the war. A high number, since the third brain qualifiers tended to take high risks in warfare. By the time the present Imperious Leader rose to the executive staff, he was one of only 6 survivors eligible for third brain implantation. The final selection was made by the Cylon in command, advised by all the former living Imperious Leaders, supplemented by analyses based upon memories of dead leaders whose brains were preserved in the historical tanks. When he had awakened from the third brain implantation, knowing immediately why he was the choice, he agreed thoroughly with that decision. All of this, plus the entire history and accumulated knowledge of the Cylon race, was his in an instant. Now he reviewed the progress of his scrupulously designed diversionary battle against the human fleet, and he looked ahead to the main plan that was about to commence. The enemy was sure to be routed. His victory over the humans would assure his place in Cylon history. He could expect to hand over command to a successor in the far future with satisfaction, knowing he would continue to be an influential leader, even in voluntary stasis. His base ship now approached the main target, the most important of the 12 targets to which he had deployed the massive forces under his command. He wished to supervise personally the destruction of the planet Caprica. His spy network had informed him that it was the home planet of his chief human enemy, Adama, and he wanted the pleasure of causing its destruction for himself. It was odd, he thought, how dealing strategically with humans as enemies for so long had forced him often to think like a human being. His predecessor had warned him that it would be necessary to utilize a portion of the massive third brain for the contemplation of human ideas, in order to counter the enemy's moves in battle. He could not deny that the ability to copy human thought processes had been invaluable in fighting this stubborn, irrational race that was the enemy. But he had never liked the times when he had to engage that part of his brain which contained the essence of human knowledge, the clumsy stronghold of unreason that housed human philosophies. Even now, as an image of the present state of Caprica was transmitted to him from several sources, he could not help seeing the coming annihilation of the humans in their own terms. Good and evil. That was the kind of concern that perplexed single-brained, inefficient human minds. If one of them had his abilities, and could penetrate the limitless dimensions of the Cylon 3 brains, the human perceiver would have been appalled that such simple dichotomies as good and evil just did not exist for the Cylons. What was essential to all Cylons was preserving the natural order of the universe, and they were relentless guardians of that order. For that reason, the humans had to be wiped out. Their adventuresome ways and overriding need to explore areas where their mere presence threatened universal order had irretrievably destined them for elimination at Cylon hands. Imperious Leader believed peace must be returned to the universe. The humans' unfortunate tendency toward independent thought and action could no longer be allowed to disturb the inhabitants of worlds whom they visited without invitations. Good and evil? He detested the human portion of his mind for forcing him to consider that subject. He envisioned the deaths he would cause, the cities he would demolish, the worlds he would reduce to rubble, and saw that from the human viewpoint all of this necessary warfare was evil. The Cylons were evil. He was evil. He detested the very concept of evil as much as he despised the concept of good. They were not opposites, and they were not mutually exclusive. Even most humans knew that. First-brain Cylons sensibly accepted the consequences of warfare as essential, and neither mourned their own deaths nor felt triumph in killing humans. Nevertheless, before initiating the destruction of Caprica, Imperious Leader found it necessary to disengage all his human philosophies so that he could concentrate on strategy. 2 executive officers strode toward him, stopped before the pedestal, and formally communicated the request to attack, a ritual that went back to early Cylon history.
"By your command,"
the first officer said.
"Speak,"
said Imperious Leader.
"All base ships are now in range to attack the colonies,"
the second officer said. As the ritual demanded, the leader removed the communications helmet and stared at his minions, his many eyes glowing with a rare moment of elation.
"Yes,"
he said.
"The final annihilation of the alien pest, the life form known as man. Let the attack begin.
The two subordinates made perfunctory bows and rejoined the spiderweb of fellow executive officers. Even before they regained position and Imperious Leader had redonned his helmet, large apertures had opened all around the main circle of each Cylon base ship. Cylon warships emerged in precise sequence from each aperture and flew to their pre-battle positions, where they formed a 12-tiered coruscating wall when fully constructed, divided into waves, each of which had a human world as its eventual target. No other colonial fleet battlestar had been able to launch full contingents of fighting craft in time. The Cylon attackers now easily picked off the ships, sitting ducks that were catapulted out. Adama realized with mixed sadness and anger that only the Galactica's fighters were left to lead the fight against the immense attacking force. Outnumbered, they already dodged and flew at Cylon fighters. Laser cannons fired and cross-fired, their radiant thin lines changing to spectacular eruptions of yellow and red flame when they found their targets. As usual, fleet warships fought with more skill and better accuracy, but the overwhelming odds of this battle, this treacherous ambush, seemed to be working against them, and Adama experienced a sharp pain in his gut each time Cylon fire destroyed one of his ships. The fleet would lose many pilots today, perhaps all of them. They had already lost Zack. Adama told himself to stop thinking of his son's death. He must stop thinking of it. It had been painful enough to watch it happen while he stood helplessly by, watching it on a screen like one of the entertainment cassettes he often watched in his quarters. There would be more pain later, but now, like all commanders who had tragically lost sons in battle, going back in time through the many devastating wars the race had endured, Adama had to keep his mind on his duties. Apollo rushed onto the bridge, and Adama hastened to his side. The young man was out of breath, and he spoke in a staccato fashion. "Cyclones! Ambush! They ambushed us. Had to leave Zack. No other option. Had to leave. Didn't want to, but had to. He's disabled. I'm going to go back and lead him in." "I'm afraid that won't be possible," Adama said. His mind raced, searching for a way to tell Apollo of Zack's death. The two brothers had been devoted to each other, and there seemed no gentle way to break the news. "Father?" Apollo said, desperation in his voice. "I left him, just hanging there. His ship was damaged. I didn't know what else to do. I've made my report. If I don't go back..." Suddenly, staring into his father's eyes, Apollo perceived their sad message. "Zack?" he said in a weak voice. Ty came to his side and spoke. "Captain Apollo, Zack's ship was destroyed just short of the fleet." But I left him." "You had no choice," Adama said gently. Apollo turned away, his face pale. Adama recalled the few times when Apollo, as a child, had shown such excruciating pain. He wished he could take the man into his arms as he had once embraced a crying boy. But Apollo would, he knew, only brush off any sympathetic touch at this moment. And Adama knew enough to let his son come to terms with his own pain. Telling Apollo again that he had had no choice, the commander quickly scanned the screens of the communications panel and ordered Ty to report. "Captain," Ty said, "we must know how many base ships we're dealing with." "No base ships," Apollo replied. some strength coming back into his voice as he attended to duty. "Only attack craft. Thousands of them. I saw them hovering over." "You must be mistaken, Captain," Ty said. "I mean, fighters couldn't function this far from Cylon War Base without base ships. They don't carry sufficient fuel and—" "There were no base ships," Apollo shouted angrily. "Just fighters. Fighters lined up from here to hell. I saw them. Maybe 1,000, maybe more. Maybe—" "How do you explain it, Apollo?" Adama said, forcing his voice to remain normal in order to quell his son's natural anger. "I don't know," Apollo said, his voice calming. "We picked up an empty tanker on our scanners. My guess is the Cylons used it to refuel for the attack. They flew to the tanker from wherever their base ships are right now." Adama's brow furrowed as he processed the information Apollo was providing. It was just the data he needed. It shed light on the elusive riddle of this sudden ambush and the fake peace conference. The thought that had been nagging him ever since the alert had been sounded came into the forefront of his mind. Ty was speaking. "Why operate so far from base ships when—" "It makes sense," Adama said. "It's more important that the base ships be someplace else." "Give me the President, now!" The President's blood-drained face flashed onto the proper screen before the echo from Adama's shouted command had faded from the bridge. Behind Adar, fire raged on the Atlantia bridge. Adar was frightened. Adama hadn't seen a look like that on his face since the day at the Academy when they sweated out the senior finals. "Mr. President," Adama said, striving to control his voice, "I request permission to leave the fleet." "Leave the fleet?" Adar screamed hysterically. "That's a cowardly—" "Adar, I've reason to suspect our home planets may face imminent attack." The President, his eyes clouding with desperation, moved out of view for a moment. The Atlantia's camera readjusted, caught the broken man leaning against a wall. "No," Adar muttered. "You're mistaken. Got to be. It's not possible. I couldn't have been that wrong. Not that wrong." "Adar, this is not time to debate the—" "Shut up, Adama! Can't you? I've led the human race, the entire human race, to ruin, to—" "Stop considering your place in history. We've got to act, man. I can't act. Can't even think straight. Can't—" "Look, Adar, it's not your fault. You didn't lead us to this disaster, but we were led." "Led? But who? Baltar?" "Of course, Baltar." "No, Commander. That couldn't be. I don't believe it. I won't." A deafening explosion drowned out the rest of Adar's sentence. The camera, blown off its moorings, momentarily caught a picture of a section of the command bridge being ripped open. Then engulfing flame rushing across. Then nothing. Adama shifted his attention to the starfield, where he could see the flagship cruising in the distance. Fires could be seen blazing inside it. Suddenly, with a burst of blinding light, it blew apart, disintegrated into thousands of pieces. After a moment, there was emptiness where the Atlantia had once been. Activity on the Galactica's bridge came to a halt, as the crew looked on in stunned silence. However, Cylon warships closed in on their own ship now, and there was little time for reverent silence. Ty now stood beside Adama, the inevitable printouts in his hands. "Look, sir, our long-range scanners have picked up Cylon base ships here, here, and here. That puts them well within range, striking range of the planets Vergon, Sagittara, and—" He could not say it, so Adama finished the sentence for him. "I know. Caprica." Athena, who had been helping plot the course of the Galactica and the enemy base ships on a large, translucent starfield map, turned suddenly at her father's words. Caprica? She whispered. Helm, Adama said, not looking at her. Bring us around. We're withdrawing. Colonel, we're heading for home. Plot the proper... Father! Athena interrupted, coming to Adama's side. What are you doing? Sir, Apollo said from his other side. Our ships. This is necessary, Adama said. We'll leave our ships behind to defend the fleet. But they can't return to us, Athena said. Yes, it is possible for them to return. They can use refueling stations to... If the refueling stations haven't been destroyed too, Apollo said bitterly. Well, Adama said, those with enough fuel, those that can obtain enough fuel, they can catch up as best they can. Sir, I must protest, Apollo said. Later, please. We should tell them, transmit our intentions. No. If we have any advantage left, any advantage at all, it's surprise. Adama briefly felt anger toward his two children as they sulked back to their positions on the bridge. Then he suppressed all emotion as he crisply gave the orders that transported the Galactica away from the embattled colonial forces. He tried not to notice that most of the power ships in the fleet were in flames. When they had moved out of range of the battle, a bridge officer announced that all electronic jamming had ceased. They're clearing the air for their electronic guidance systems, Apollo said. That means the attack is underway, Ty said. No, sir, said a bridge officer. We're picking up long-range video satellite signals. Everything looks perfectly normal at home. Everybody's attention centered on the monitors that displayed scenes of Caprica. Adama concentrated particularly on an aerial view that showed Caprica's beautiful pyramidal architecture to a particularly good advantage. He had a similar view in his workroom at home, not far from the scene he was watching. Ela had given the hollow-view to him. He must not think of Ela now. Clearly, it was a beautiful day in Caprica's capital city. A downtown area bustled with shoppers. A row of residence pyramids appeared serene. The communications board was picking up broadcast transmissions. It all looked so peaceful, so much like the scenes they had all anticipated returning to at the conclusion of the peace mission, so ordinary that Adama for a moment considered that the battle behind them had proven a lie, a dream, and instead they now flew toward a glorious reality. Commander, Ty said quietly, Perhaps we're in time. Or maybe the Cylon attack on our fleet was just some action of a dissident faction, a small anti-peace movement trying to cause trouble. Not likely, Ty, Adama said. Not likely. The wave of Cylon warships appeared suddenly, as if from nowhere, on a screen adjacent to the home planet views. Serena's eyes teared from the steady glaring light bouncing off the fronts of the all-glass shopping mall buildings. In the middle of giving orders to her technicians about where to set up the TV equipment, she whispered into the microphone of her makeup kit and told it to come up with something to alter the tear level in her eyes. It produced a sturdy, treated tissue with which she dabbed away the offending moisture. Besides acting as a sponge, it also medically soothed her eyes' irritation. As she attended to her work, many startled passers-by stopped to stare at her, the price of being a media personality known all over Caprica. For herself, she had grown tired of the face known to millions. It was beautiful, sure, with all that auburn hair, plus the green eyes, and the full, sensuous mouth, not to mention the slim, curvaceous figure that had become the Caprican ideal of beauty. But when you had to check it out daily, almost hourly, on monitors, verifying that it was suitable for general viewing, you could easily get sick of such comeliness. Her ear receiver announced 30 seconds to airtime, and she got into position in front of the camera. As the count worked down to 0, she spot-checked the scene immediately behind her. She was pleased with the beauty of the flower arrangements, especially the raised quarter circle of brightly colored flowers spelling out the word peace. Above the word were spread the flags of the 12 colonies. How impressive, she thought. And what a marvelous backdrop for the celebration that's going to break loose when the peace is officially announced. The count reached 0. The red light came on, and Serena began her speech.
Serena here at the Caprica Presidium, where preparations continue as they have continued through the night for the ceremonies that will commence when the long-awaited announcement is beamed here for the peace conference. Even though it's early dawn here, large crowds of people have gathered all around the Presidium complex. Anticipation is growing as Capricans ready themselves to usher in a new era of peace. So far, details of the armistice meetings are not coming in as hoped for because of an unusual electrical interference blocking out interstellar communication. We've not yet even received official announcements regarding the rendezvous with the Cylon emissaries. However, as soon as information is available, you will see first pictures of what has been described as the most significant event since...
The sound of a distant rumbling explosion was followed by a closer, ear-splitting noise of shattering glass as windows and door panels all around the Presidium broke simultaneously, sending shards of glass flying everywhere. The cameraman pointed in a direction behind Serena and to her left. She turned and looked that way. People near her had stopped working. Most of them looked back toward the area where the explosion had occurred. A few hurried past her, toward the mall exit. Farther away, some raucous shouting began. Serena beckoned toward her cameraman and soundwoman, while still addressing the camera.
Excuse me, something's happened. Come on, Morel, Prina. Let's see what it is. Excuse me, sir, madam. Could you let us by, please? I don't know what it is, but it sounded to me like some kind of explosion. Perhaps some sabotage from dissidents. If there are such a thing as dissidents on Caprica. Listen to that crackle of glass underfoot. You picking up that, Prina? Yes? Fine. I really don't know what... Wait. Here comes someone. Ma'am, could you tell me what... I guess she's not telling anybody anything. She looked scared, I thought. Maybe you noticed. Wait a minute. Let's see if we can... Excuse me. Pardon me.
Elbowing her way through the milling crowd while maintaining continual check to see that her crew followed her, Serena forced her way to an open spot. Morel, her cameraman, quickly set up the camera and nodded to her to begin.
I still haven't figured out what... Oh no. Morel, get that on camera, quick!
Morel pointed the camera where she directed. At the horizon, beyond the city, where a huge, brilliant fireball was rising like a drifting but erratic sun. It was followed by another, just as huge and just as bright.
A tremendous explosion,
Serena said, looking toward her soundwoman to make sure it had been recorded. When the aftershock rumble faded, she resumed her commentary.
2 explosions. You saw them on camera. People are beginning to run in all directions. This is terrible. Horrible.
She hoped her voice was not giving away that it was all so exciting.
Nobody seems to know.
She was interrupted by a Cylon warship streaking across the sky, shooting bursts from laser weapons into the crowd. Around her, people started to fall. Oh my gosh, Serena thought. This is real. It's war. It's not just a disaster, it's... A pyramid to her left exploded with a thunderous roar. A monolithic building farther away started to fall forward, splitting away from its foundation, pieces of it falling onto a running mob. The whole street began to rock, and Serena fell unglamorously into a clump of greenery. She looked up. Morel was steadily aiming the camera her way.
Not at me, Morel. The explosions, the fire. This is terrible. Ladies and gentlemen, it's terrible. Someone's bombing Caprica City. It looks like Cylon...
A fighter swinging low over the city made her duck her head into the bushes. It fired in her direction. A young woman running by her plunged to the ground. Standing up, Serena started to go to her aid and realized suddenly that she was dead.
She's dead. Morel, Prina, we better get under cover. We better...
Throngs of people ran by her, jostled her, almost made her fall again. More explosions, screams, planes firing. Morel continued to point the camera at her.
It's hopeless, she said. People are dying all around me. I don't even know if we're still on the air. I see a small child over there running for us. Look out! Look!
Another low-flying plane released another volley of laser fire. Morel was hit along with his camera. Sparks flew from the splitting camera as Morel fell to the ground. Prina started to run, abandoning her soundboard. Serena threw down the microphone and ran toward the young boy she had seen chasing after an animal. Another swooping attack fighter came directly at them, its laser cannon at full blast. Diving, Serena pushed the child away from the burning laser path before it reached them. Holding the trembling child close to her, she watched an entire wave of fighters scream by, their weapons indiscriminately adding to the awesome destruction. A pillar of concrete crashed a few feet away. Serena tried to ignore the yells of pain amid the rubble. Something fell upon her, and suddenly there was no air. One of her arms was still free and she could move it. She began frantically digging toward the surface, resisting the driving impulse to take a breath. Her arm broke through. She frenetically shaped an escape hatch in the dirt and pulled herself and the child into the air. After taking a quick inhalation, she pulled the child all the way out of the hole and checked him over to ensure he was all right. He was a small boy, about 6 years old.
"Don't try to move for a minute,"
she said to him. The boy began to cry, and Serena pulled him to her, comforting him.
"Everything's going to be all right,"
she said.
"Muffet,"
the boy said.
"Where's Muffet?"
"Who?"
My Daggett, where is he?" "Your Daggett. Oh, I'm sure he's fine."
Daggets, animals native to Caprica, had been easily domesticated by the first colonists and had become the favorite choice of pet among younger children. Parents liked the four-legged, short-furred rascals because, in spite of their playfulness, they always protected children. Serena smiled. She was continually amazed by the unique ways children focused their concentration. This boy, unaware of the meaning of the Cylon invasion, was more concerned about his lost pet than the devastation around him. He probably thought finding the Daggett would set everything right again. Although the Cylon fighters no longer flew across the sky, the dust from their attack was still settling all around Serena and the boy.
"Muffet! Muffet!"
the boy hollered.
"I'm sure he's fine, honey,"
Serena said, trying to make her voice sound as if she believed every word. A tall man ran toward them, his bloody left arm hanging limp and useless at his side. "Move, everyone!" he shouted. "Move! Evacuate the center!"
"My Daggett,"
the boy said.
"Where is—"
"This isn't any time to think about," the man said, but Serena waved him to shut up.
"Come on,"
she said softly.
"We have to go. I'm sure your Daggett is all right."
"Please, miss!" the man screamed desperately. "The building there'll topple at any moment." Serena looked in the direction toward which the man's functioning arm waved. Before she located the about-to-collapse building, her eyes fixed on a pillar from which what looked like a Daggett's limbs stuck out. Shielding the boy's head, she maneuvered a few steps toward the pillar. It was the Daggett, all right, crushed underneath the pillar, its pointed snout buried in dirt and rubble. Turning her body so that it screened any possible view the boy could have of the dead animal, she pointed in the opposite direction and said,
"There he is. Must have been him, running that way. Let's go have a look." "I want Muffet. Is he all right?"
She picked up the boy, holding him close.
"Sure he's all right. Everything is all right. Everything is going to be just fine. Just fine. What's your name?" "Boxy."
She wiped some of the dust from the boy's face. He was a cherub-faced child, with large brown eyes and a shock of curly brown hair hanging down on his forehead. She imagined that shock of hair was continually getting in his eyes.
"Hello, Boxy,"
she said. She looked past him at what remained of the city. Not much remained. The buildings that still stood were rocked with explosions, bursting with fire. The wounded man pulled at her with his good arm, and still carrying Boxy, she began to run. She had not looked back at the sound of the crashing building behind her. As they hurried past the place where her camera had been originally set up, in front of the floral arrangement spelling peace, she noticed that the flowers had been completely buried and that the flags of the 12 colonies were in flames. Athena kept glancing covertly at her father to check on his reactions to the dreadful slaughter they were all helplessly viewing on the Galactica's multi-screened communications console. Most people would have expressed the opinion that Adama was emotionless, that he didn't react at all to the Holocaust, but Athena knew better. She detected the somber pain in his eyes. He stood stiffly, nodding at the reports of his officers, but Athena could tell he was thinking of her mother, who lived in a suburb of the smoldering Caprica city. She wished they could leave their duties, be father and daughter again for just a minute, go to a quiet room and hold each other. But that was not possible. Mother's got to be all right, she thought. She's got to be. Ty had moved to his commander's side with the latest report. "Sir," he said, "long-range scanners are picking up Cylon base ships, launching to all outer planets." Athena, hearing this, wanted to slam her fist down on the panel of gauges in front of her. A conversation she had had just a few days ago with Zack and Apollo came back to her vividly. She had been arguing with them about the coming peace mission, contending that the Cylons could be trusted. They were at the very least an intelligent race. Apollo said Cylons might have technological prowess, but he wasn't so sure they could be described as intelligent, at least in human terms. It was an old argument, one that she had had countless times since joining the service. Cylons might be intelligent, but they were certainly not compassionate. They were hardly, in fact, emotional at all. Apollo, like many others, believed that the ability to feel was necessary for intelligence. Athena held to her belief that the Cylons must have feeling, must have emotion. It just wasn't describable in human language. Since their cultural systems were so entirely different, she argued, we must search for and discover the other differences too. Their argument had become quite heated, even though she and Apollo knew the debate itself was ancient, almost ritualistic. Zack broke it up by laughing suddenly and saying they should all get falling down drunk in order to make their argument more logical. They all laughed. Their father, walking in on the hysterical trio, chided them for silliness below the call of duty. It had been a nice moment, a fine moment, the last time they'd joined in warmth as a family. Now Zack was dead, and Athena didn't want to think deeply about that just now. She tried to shake the sorrowful thoughts out of her head by taking a reading of her equipment. However, she couldn't help but watch the monitors often. Planetside, things were worse. Fires everywhere. Buildings still falling. Corpses tucked into doorways and corners of rubble, as if arranged for viewing. The scattered survivors moved slowly, sluggishly, in a collective state of shock. Adama turned away from the terrible pictures, his shoulders slumped in defeat. She knew that she looked just as miserable. She felt comatose. The nightmare had to end soon. She must wake up. A hand gripped her shoulder. She looked up into the grim face of Apollo. She pulled away from him, feeling illogically angry at his pain, furious at the downcast look of her father. She could no longer hold her feelings in, and she raged at Apollo.
"First Zack, now this. They trusted us to protect them."
She sensed her father looking distressfully her way.
"How could we let it happen? Why were we guarding a bunch of corrupt politicians instead of our homes? We let it happen. We just let it happen.
She looked toward Adama, saw the pain in his face again, wished she hadn't spoken. He was commander. When she said, "How could we let it happen?" she knew that inside he heard, "Why did you let it happen?" She wouldn't be able to take that back. It was true, but she wouldn't be able to take it back. For the next few minutes, she performed her duties still in the dream state, but all the concentration she could work up would not push all the gruesome memories of destruction out of her mind. If only Starbuck were here to cheer her up, she thought. But she didn't even know where he was. They had left him behind with the others. They had abandoned. He had to come back. At least Starbuck had to come back. She needed him now. Ty called everybody's attention to the largest monitor screen. The Cylon base ships had now been located. One of them could be seen in close-up, the other two in the distance. All of them were launching more fighters. Another officer locked in scenes from all of the 12 worlds. Each picture showed Cylon fighters on bombing runs. "What are the reports from the 12 worlds, Colonel?" Adama asked. "No hope, Commander." "There's always... What about Sagittara? They have the most sophisticated defense system in all the worlds. Perhaps there's still time." "Sorry, Commander. The planet is in flames." Athena had never seen her father so pale, so close to collapse. She took a tentative step toward him. He saw her and waved her away. He turned to Ty. "Prepare my shuttlecraft," he said. Ty appeared as startled as everyone else who heard the commander's request. "Shuttlecraft?" Ty said. "I'm going down to the surface of Caprica, Ty." "That's out of the question, Commander. You can't." "Colonel, prepare the..." "Sir, if the Cylon scanner should pick you up when you get out of the camouflage force field..." "I'm going with you," Apollo said.
"Yes,"
said Athena.
"I also."
Adama touched her arm, spoke softly. "You stay here. We'll be all right."
"But I want to."
"You're needed here." She capitulated to the firm tone of command in Adama's voice. As elder brother, it was Apollo's right to take this particular trip, even though it was usually her job to pilot the shuttlecraft for her father. "We'll go in my fighter, Father," Apollo said. "You're the last surviving member of the Quorum. If we run into a Cylon attack ship, at least you'll have a chance." "The captain's right," Ty said. "And since I'm the one who has to fill your shoes if anything happens, well, I insist you go down in the fighter, Commander." Adama nodded at Ty. "You proceed to rendezvous with the survivors of the fleet. Make all necessary preparation. You must proceed as if I might not return." "Not return?" Ty said. "You'll return, Commander." Ty extended his hand, and the two men, old friends as well as fellow officers, who had served together for more than 3 decades, clasped each other's wrists as they shook hands.